From drawing and painting, we're moving on to printmaking. And a print is a hand-produced image transferred from a printing surface to a piece of paper, usually from a plate, a piece of metal or a piece of wood onto the paper surface. Now, this is not the same as photographic printing, photographic reproduction, which would be a poster in your dorm room or something like that. In this case, these are short-run pieces created by an artist, maybe creating 10 versions or 25 versions, and then oftentimes destroying the plate. The reason they destroy the plate is to limit supply and guarantee originality. So when you read that something is a limited edition, you know, hopefully, that the artist has destroyed the plate and won't create any more of these pieces. And we're going to start with relief printing. And this is the simplest form of printing. You may have done this in grade school or high school, cutting a linoleum block or an eraser. And here the ink sits on the raised surface, and so you cut away all of the negative space. You cut away everything that you don't want printed on the final piece. We usually see this for woodblock printing. And the most famous version of this is going to be, or most famous form, is created by the Japanese. Many of their woodblock prints, especially when we get to the 19th century, have phenomenal detail. And here we have the Great Wave by Kandegawa. And this is one of those woodblock prints in relief printing. Each one of these colors would have to be a different block, and then they all have to register together. In other words, they all have to fit together on the page to create the perfect image. And when you look at this, there's 7 or 8 different colors, different blocks that would have been necessary to create this image. Then we have intaglio printing. Intaglio printing means that the ink is in the cuts. It's not on the raised surface of our plate. What this means from an artist perspective is I'm cutting out where I want a line instead of cutting where I don't want a line. And that's a lot easier from an artist perspective because we all know how to draw a line. You can imagine how that transfers. And there are different forms of this. There's etching and there's engraving. So etching is printing by taking a plate, usually a metal plate, covering it in wax, and then you cut away the wax. And then you dip the plate in acid, and the acid eats away at the metal that's exposed by cutting away the wax. This is a fantastic method. It's easy to do. Cutting in wax is very simple. If you make a mistake, all you do is put a little more wax on and then continue on. So it's very straightforward, but it sometimes lacks some detail. And we see pieces like this by Rembrandt where he's using that etching technique. Then we have engraving. Engraving is more difficult because I'm not cutting into wax. Instead, I'm actually cutting into the metal surface, which means I need special tools, and if I make a mistake, I can't really go back and put more metal back in. I have to usually scrap the project and move on from there. So this is working directly on the surface. Oftentimes, artists, especially in Northern Europe, will mix the two processes. So they'll do an etching, and then they'll go in and add additional detail through engraving. And the most famous form of engraving that we see today is, of course, money. All our money is printed through engraving. It's done through a series of plates. So if you're going to counterfeit money, don't use a Xerox. You need to cut your own engraving plate, which might make it worth simply not counterfeiting the money, but let's leave that aside. Then we have what are called the planographic processes. In this case, it means that everything's on the same level with lithograph as well as with silkscreen. So we're not trying to cut into the material as such. We'll start with lithograph. Now with lithograph, you're using an oil-based, usually an oil-based pencil, to create your image. And then you use water-based materials to block the stone all around it. and the ink is oil-based. So the oil-based ink won't mix with the water-based background. It'll only attach itself to the oil-based ink that you used, or the oil-based pencil. So it's basically oil and water don't mix. And these can be very rapidly created. In fact, when we go back to, for example, the 19th century, lithograph is used for news articles quite regularly because you could create a lithograph overnight and have quite a few prints of it made very, very rapidly. So very effective process, but most things that you see today that are called lithograph are not. We now use lithograph today to refer to almost all digital printing, which is of course a whole different process. Then we have silkscreen. If you want to start a business in college, this is what you want to do. Start a silkscreening business, because for less than $5,000, you can crank out 1,000 shirts or more a day. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a frame and you're going to put a piece, it used to be silk, but now it's nylon, on the surface, stretching it out. And then you cover the whole thing with a photo emulsion. And what that does is I'm going to take my design, I'm going to put it on a light table, and then I put my frame with the photo emulsion on top of it. Wherever the light hits the photo emulsion, it hardens. Anywhere that it doesn't, I can wash away. So consequently, I have a stencil. And all I'm doing is pushing the ink through the stencil. Very simple and straightforward. And it's used not only for t-shirts and just about any kind of printed clothing that we see, but it's also used for art. And in art, it's referred to as a serigraph. S-E-R-I-G-R-A-P-H. And that's mostly because most artists don't want to say, hey, I'm silk screening this. It sounds a little bit fancier. It's what we do in art. We make things sound fancy. It also allows for repetition and mass production. So that's why we use it for t-shirts and such. I can create 10,000 silk screens from a single canvas. I don't have to replace it after every 10 or 20 individual prints.